Godzilla needs no introduction. He's been around for decades, with dozens of movies across several different continuities. As I write this, it's possible that you've seen that there are not one, but several separate live-action Godzilla projects in production as we speak. Two of them taking place in the established MonsterVerse, with a shared continuity with all the movies in that series. The third, a brand new movie from Toho, seemingly doing something totally fresh with the monster. As a fan, I look forward to these and seeing what each of them has to offer. Can I just tell you how lucky I feel to be able to say this? I mean, there was a time when that absolutely was not the case. See, when I was younger, about 7, 8, 9 years old, Godzilla stuff in the United States at least was really tough to come by, and being a fan, especially a young fan at that time, it was a challenge. In the really early 90s, the fact is there just wasn't that much stuff for me to be able to get my hands on, and that was frustrating for me as a kid, you know? I always wanted to have toys of the things I liked, and Godzilla, you just really couldn't. So if you've been around the channel for a little while and you know who I am and you know what I'm talking about, you know that King Kong was like pretty much life-changing for me as a little kid. You know, the big monsters, the stop-motion animation, it's a huge part of the reason why I'm here on YouTube doing this kind of stuff and the animation that I'm doing now. It's a big influence on my life. And as a little kid who's into King Kong, well, what's the natural progression there? Enter Godzilla. Giant monsters, huge scale fight scenes, tons of destruction, it was all there. And yeah, it wasn't stop motion, but by then I had seen the 1976 remake of King Kong, so the idea of suitmation, aka a guy acting in a monster suit, was something I was already pretty familiar with. I remember it vividly. I was with some family at their house, and my cousin had a drawer full of some Godzilla movies, along with some other assorted kaiju flicks that I would end up checking out eventually. The first one I ever saw, my first experience with these movies, was Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. When I tell you it was eye-opening, I don't know if that description even does it justice. Seeing Godzilla destroying cities, annihilate another monster in his way, and do it all with such a destructive terror about him, I was hooked. So I'm gonna spoil a movie from like the mid-1970s, but it turns out that's not really Godzilla that was doing all that destruction. It was Mechagodzilla in disguise as Godzilla. You know, if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about already, but the real Godzilla shows up, and then the two of them get into a big fight, and of course, being my first experience with these movies, I was just sucked all the way in. I'm just like, wow, this is, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy? There's so much complexity and so much layers. This is, cinema. Now these days, of course, that's all pretty reserved. Like, you can see the plot twist coming a mile off, especially if you know what you're looking at. But me, I had no idea. I was drawn in and I was instantly hooked, and I became a big fan. Becoming a fan of Godzilla at that time would prove pretty challenging. Now, regular viewers of my channel already know what I'm all about here, but if you're new, I'm a hobby guy. Action figures, stop-motion animation, collecting, dioramas, pop culture stuff. These are the same interests I've held onto pretty much ever since I was a kid. The only difference is so much of this stuff is now way more accessible than it was back when I was much younger. Especially when you're talking about Godzilla. See, when you're a kid and you see an awesome movie, what's the first thing you want? You're gonna want a toy of the character so you can play out your own adventures. Or, in this case, your own giant monster scenes. The problem is, this was like 1991, so Godzilla, as far as my experience went as a kid in the United States, was pretty much unheard of. See, every kid in my class knew about Super Mario and the Ninja Turtles and all that kind of stuff, and everybody loved it. Me too, I loved all that stuff. But the second I tried to bring up Godzilla, well, blank stares from everybody. Nobody knew what I was talking about, nobody knew anything about this whole monster, this whole franchise, none of it. And you remember before when I said how I wanted a Godzilla toy? Well, it was slim pickings there too. Somewhere along the line, I did end up with a few pieces of Godzilla merchandise. Namely, a decent collection of movies on VHS, but eventually I did end up with an action figure. This would have been the Imperial Godzilla, which is pretty infamous these days. He's a big figure, probably about a foot tall. He was bright green with a silver chest and red lips. A departure from the movies for sure, but listen, I was just gonna take whatever I can get, alright? I also got my hands on the NES game, Godzilla Monster of Monsters, which by today's standards is really nothing special. I'd say that the creepypasta story is probably more popular than this actual game ever was. But as a kid, I convinced myself this was some kind of classic. Godzilla and Mothra fighting against many of the enemy monsters from the original movies, including a few that I never heard of, which turned out to be from other movies entirely. Sign me all the way up. This game was difficult, punishing at times, but I used to play it all the time. The gameplay was repetitive, the level design wasn't great, but that wasn't why I played. It was the monster fights that were the main event for me, and the game's soundtrack was killer too. I also had the second game, War of the Monsters, but yeah, the less said about that one, the better. Anyway, some years passed. I remained a Godzilla fan, even despite not being able to really have merchandise or toys or any of that kind of stuff, at least not in the capacity that I wanted. I would, scour video stores, Sam Goody, Media Play, Suncoast Video, remember those? I would try and find as many Godzilla movies as I could get my hands on, and that became how I got familiar with all these monsters and this universe and all this kind of stuff. And that was pretty much all we had. Until Trendmasters. I don't remember where I was or how I figured out that there were new Godzilla figures available, but when I saw them, it blew me away. There were a few different kinds of figures in this line. Standard 5-inch articulated plastic ones, larger 10-inch size versions, and smaller rubber figures with metal wiring. These were only about 4 inches tall, but they had a lot of movement due to, essentially, being seamless bodies with bendable inner workings. These were the first ones I got, since I thought they'd look good in stop motion. Yeah, I was still trying to make stop motion way back in the 90s, as a 10-year-old with analog video equipment and rudimentary editing techniques. Didn't really work. I think my stop motion is better now. Anyway, the line had several monsters in the first wave. Godzilla, Mothra, Rodan, Mechagodzilla, King Ghidorah, and Mechaghidorah. I can remember thinking, Mechaghidorah? What is this? What's that all about? Like, we're only in Series 1 of these toys, and they're already making up their own monsters? Like, Mechaghidorah is not a real thing. Where's Hydra? Where's Gigan? Where's my boy Megalon? Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Remember, I was a kid, and I only had the VHS tapes that I could find at the time, which means I had no idea that there were movies continuously being made all the way up through the 90s and up to that point in history. So, to my knowledge, Godzilla 1985 was the last Godzilla movie ever produced. And so anything that came after, I just didn't know about it. See, the internet wasn't really a household thing yet, at least not in the early part of the 90s. So being a fan of stuff like this, well, you wouldn't really necessarily have the access to it the way we do today, especially not as a kid. So, when you're an expert at whatever age I was, 10 probably at the time, and you think you know everything about these monsters, and all of a sudden they're throwing Mechaghidorah at you, you can say, well, that's not real. Well, it is. I just didn't know any better. Well, it turns out Trendmasters had their finger on the pulse the entire time, and they were doing all this Heisei stuff that I had just never heard of. Meanwhile, I'm looking at it going like, Batra, Biolante, Space Godzilla, who are these guys? Like, is this like Ken or Batman where they're just making stuff up and selling the toys? I mean, probably. I mean, not really, but that's what I thought. The line also had a bunch of micro playsets, static figures, and human characters that were supposed to battle all the monsters. I didn't get into any of those, but I did find myself reading a few of the Dark Horse Godzilla comics that were coming out around that time. And these comics told their own stories and introduced their own adversaries. Interesting timeline for sure. But then, something happened that would put Godzilla back on the map in a big way. For better or for worse. In 1998, TriStar Pictures released their Godzilla movie, a total departure from any of the Toho continuity. This was from the makers of Independence Day a few years prior, and it had Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin's fingerprints all over it. The quippy dialogue, the updated take on the source material that just completely does its own thing altogether. I'll be honest, I'm not going to get into the entire reaction of that movie. Plenty of other videos on YouTube cover everything from the making of, to the audience response, to the subsequent animated series, all of it. I'm just here to talk about being a collector, and having Godzilla be one of the big focal points of the toy aisles for the first time in my life. Now sure, the original Trendmasters toys did have some spotlight, there was TV spots, there was ads, there was a couple different series and different things as we mentioned, but the movie line, that was the big deal. That was, the front feature shop at Toys R Us. That was the end cap to aisle 7C at Toys R Us. You know the one if you're old like me. Yeah, it had all the big stuff and the big cardboard cutouts of Godzilla. It was all right there. Now, TriStar was hoping for a huge, blockbuster type deal, and they wanted the toy sales to match, and all this stuff was coming out and hitting hard. I had a couple of them. I had just one or two versions of Godzilla, because they made all the human characters too. You could go buy your Matthew Broderick action figure if you wanted, but nobody's checking for that in the toy aisle. Everybody just wants Godzilla, just regular Godzilla, and that's all I got out of the line. If I can veer to one side for a second, what's funny now is that usually, you hear of movie spoilers coming out in the way of Lego sets or something like that. You see online where somebody spots a Lego set in the toy store and it spoils a big, huge battle scene in an upcoming Marvel movie or something, whatever. Well, back then, it was photos of action figures that actually spoiled the design of Godzilla from the movie. You see, the marketing of that movie was very shrewd about showing you Godzilla's design. You saw his foot or maybe the end of his tail or a shadow or something, but you never really saw the full Godzilla until the movie came out. That is, unless you were online looking at toys. Now, remember when I said the internet wasn't a prominent thing earlier in the 90s, but this was 98, and a lot more households had the internet, which means I was right on there, probably 7th or 8th grade, looking up my Godzilla 1998 spoilers and things to see how this movie was going to go. And sure enough, the big Ultimate Trendmasters Godzilla figure. I saw that picture of that figure, and that showed me what Godzilla was going to look like in this movie, for better or for worse. So yeah, the more things change, the more they stay the same. These days it's Legos spoiling Marvel movies. Back then it was Trendmasters toys spoiling Godzilla's design. So leave it to the toys, they're always going to be the spoilers. But getting back to the movie and the blockbuster potential of the TriStar movie, I think it became pretty obvious that that movie didn't perform the way they wanted it to. I mean, yeah, there was a degree of success to it, certainly, and there was a cartoon series that followed up that many people think is better than the movie. I've never seen it, so I don't know. So the reviews didn't really do that movie any favors, and the whole Godzilla 1998 project from TriStar just kind of died a death. I don't think it did what they wanted it to do. I mean, famously, Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich just didn't really like Godzilla, didn't want to make a Godzilla movie. They just wanted the name, and that's it. So, like, those guys... What are you doing? One company who was not particularly impressed with Godzilla 1998 and its performance was none other than Toho. And because Toho wasn't impressed, they decided to launch into a whole new continuity of movies. This would become the Millennium series as we know it today, but the first one was Godzilla 2000. I can remember seeing Godzilla 2000 in theaters. It somehow got a limited US release. I don't think it did particularly well. From what I've heard, a lot of people thought it was a sequel to the 98 movie, which meant that some audiences just didn't go because they didn't want to see a sequel to that movie. Then there was other people who did go, but they ended up confused by what they were watching since it obviously had nothing to do with the 98 TriStar movie. Just a victim of poor marketing and no promotion. If I recall correctly, I think my dad and I were the only two people in the theater for Godzilla 2000. And so we've come to the year 2000, which ends my recollection of being a Godzilla fan as a kid throughout the 90s. By 2000, I was like in high school, probably 15 or 16 years old. Technology was like at the forefront. You know, everybody was online. We're starting to see kind of that perpetually online state that most people exist in right now. That was just kind of starting to come to fruition back in those days. Now, technically, this whole video was supposed to kind of put into perspective the difficulty of being a Godzilla fan in the 90s, but I got a few tidbits that extend past the year 2000. That's right, we're adding some post-90s stuff in this video. What do you say? Hey. In 2003, me and Mountain Man used to hang out all the time. Basically, we'd kill time by seeing movies, scouring the mall, video games, all that kind of thing. It was around this time that we spotted Godzilla movies in the DVD section of FYE, Best Buy, any of those kinds of places. I can't put into words how cool that was. Picture somebody coming up to you saying like, hey, you know that thing that you really like? Turns out there's a lot more of it than you were ever aware of, and now it's all available. Have fun. So suddenly all the dots in my head just started connecting. So all those Trendmasters toys of Batra and Bylante and Mecha Ghidorah and all those guys, all of a sudden I started finally realizing that these are real monsters. And Trendmasters, they had their finger on the pulse way more than I ever did. And like I said, this was 2003, so not only were all the old Heisei movies available on DVD, but all the Millennium ones that had been released up till that time. So that meant Megaguirus and GMK and the Mechagodzilla 3, the Kiryu movies. Those were all right there on the DVD shelves. I couldn't believe it. I was in heaven. Now, as you do when you find out about all this stuff that you missed over the years, you get right on the internet, and that's what I did. I was studying up on all those Godzilla movies that I missed over the years, and all this information was just... it was wild to me. You mean to tell me that there's 3 versions of Mechagodzilla, and they all do different stuff? You mean to tell me that there's a movie where Godzilla is bad and Ghidorah is the good guy? And you mean to tell me there's a movie that's not even out yet called Final Wars, which is coming out the year 2004, the year I was reading about that, and it's gonna have all these monsters from the previous movies for one last big showdown? Oh, it was an amazing, amazing thing to find that out. I bought that Final Wars DVD for full price the day it came out, and I've never looked back. It was awesome. And I guess that's kind of where the struggle ends. You know, like I said, in the 90s, it was very slim pickings, but by 2004, you could pretty much get your hands on anything. Since then, I mean, even if you were a collector of Godzilla stuff, it was a lot easier to pick and choose what you wanted to get, and it was a lot more available. The video games that were coming out at the time were a lot of fun. There was the Pipeworks ones, they were great. All the DVDs and stuff that were out at the time, I could finally watch and have a ton of these like tiny little full circle moments, you know, from being a kid and seeing these monsters from the first time, all the way up to being an adult and having these experiences watching those movies for the first time. It was great, it was magic, it was incredible. Of course, nowadays, there's no shortage of Godzilla figures and collectibles available. You want Toho stuff? It's right in Target. What about the toys for the new Legendary Monsterverse movies? Sure, those are all over the place anytime there's a new movie out. Maybe you want higher quality collector pieces. Well, you got a lot of stuff to pick from, and you got a lot of range as far as scale, articulation, and cost. You want new movies? Well, 2 new movies in development as I write this, plus a series for Apple TV. Comics? IDW's got you. Video games? Well, I mean, at least they're trying, I guess. So I say this frequently about a lot of different franchises and properties, but right now, as I record this at the end of 2023, it really is a great time to be a fan. If you're a Godzilla fan and you're a little kid, you could just walk into the store and buy your Godzilla toys. It's great. Everything you want is right there. You could go to school and talk to your friends about Godzilla, and they're gonna know what you're talking about. I didn't have that. Godzilla's entered the pop culture lexicon in the United States among younger kids and, you know, teenagers and stuff, whoever's liking this stuff, I don't know. But there's enough movies and enough toys and enough merchandise to sustain that now, whereas when I was a kid, wasn't the case. So I'm happy for that growth. I think that's awesome. I know a little kid version of me would be very jealous knowing that this is the future that we would inherit, and he's got to wait all those years. Sucker. So yeah, there's been a lot of progress made. And speaking of progress, do you remember when I said earlier that Godzilla 2000 got a limited theatrical release in the United States when it came out? Well, turns out Fandom Events in the year 2023 is doing a limited theatrical release. Again, it's a one-night only showing. I'm obviously going to see it because, you know, that was the first Toho Godzilla movie that I ever saw in the theater, so I'm going to want to revisit that. And I don't think I've seen it since that time in the theater, so it's been 23 years since I've seen this movie. I could go again. And I'm definitely going again. We're in here. It's just about 7 p.m. Movie's about to start half an hour or so. You see, this entire video, the reason I'm making it is to kind of demonstrate how Godzilla and that whole franchise has just been like a huge part of my personal history. And remember when I was talking about those full circle moments earlier? Well, now we're at the point where not only is Godzilla a huge part of my personal history, I now have the opportunity to be a very small part of Godzilla's history. How about it? You remember earlier when I said I was a stop motion animator? I gotta tell you, that's a very surreal experience. A stop motion animation that I created of Godzilla, one of my lifelong favorite franchises, played in a movie theater in front of a Godzilla. Not just a movie theater, but every movie theater showing that movie. So anybody that went to see that movie, they got to see something made by me in celebration of Godzilla in front of a Godzilla movie. That's wild. That's awesome. See, if I can go back in time and tell that 7-year-old version of myself anything, it'd probably be something along the lines of like, hey dude, it's gonna work out. You're gonna get plenty of Godzilla. There's gonna be more movies than you know what to do with. And then when you think you've seen them all, there's gonna just be more and more even after that. There's gonna be plenty of these Godzilla movies and you're gonna be able to go see them in theaters. And in fact, one of them is gonna have an animation that you're gonna make playing in front of it. Thank you for watching. I hope this gives you a better understanding of what it was like in the 90s as a little kid trying to be a Godzilla fan. Wasn't easy. It was challenging to even find anybody who cared about Godzilla, let alone anybody who had toys or games or any of it. It's not like today. I think we're in a better place today. If there is a kid who's interested in Godzilla, he can just walk right in the store, find whatever he wants. It's great. As a fan over all these years, it's been awesome to kind of see the cultural acceptance, I guess, of Godzilla by Americans. You know, going from where nobody really cared that much when I was a kid to now it's a big deal. It's a big franchise. There's lots of people who love it, and I couldn't be happier. If this is your first time on the channel and you like what you see, there's other videos for you to watch. I do stop motion, I do hobby-related content. We talk action figures, dioramas, all of it. It's all here. Check it out if you want. I'll love you if you do. Big thanks to all my Patreon backers. You guys, you know how much I love you. My name is Captain McKay, and I'll catch you in the next one. Later on.
That's crisp.